This is a homily for the 30th Sunday in Ordinary Time. The first reading is from the book of Ecclesiasticus, chapter 35, verses 12 to 14 and verses 16 to 19. The second reading is from St. Paul's second letter to Timothy, chapter 4, verses 6 to 8 and verses 16 to 18. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 18, verses 9 to 14. To download the text of this homily as a PDF file, go to sundayhomilies.au. We have almost reached the end of St. Luke's account of the journey of Jesus and his disciples to Jerusalem. As you can see, Luke's account of this journey is the longest section of his Gospel. The Sunday lectionary has devoted 19 weeks to what Jesus did and said during this pilgrimage to Jerusalem, from the 13th to the 31st Sunday of Ordinary Time. However, our readings from Luke's Gospel will be interrupted this year by the celebration of two feast days, firstly on the 31st and then on the 32nd Sunday of Ordinary Time. We have the commemoration of all the faithful departed, or All Souls' Day, next Sunday, and the feast of the dedication of the Lateran Basilica on the following Sunday. Since we won't be hearing the readings for Ordinary Time on those two Sundays, let me fill you in briefly on what you'll be missing. The Gospel for the 31st Sunday of Ordinary Time tells us that Jesus and the disciples have reached Jericho, and they are about to make the final ascent to Jerusalem. The Gospel for the 31st Sunday in Ordinary Time is the story of Jesus and Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector. Zacchaeus was a short man and had difficulty trying to see Jesus, so he climbed a sycamore tree to catch a glimpse of Jesus as he passed by. As Jesus passed the tree, he looked up and said, "Zacchaeus, come down, hurry, for I am to stay at your house today." As you can see from this map, Jericho is to the northeast of Jerusalem. The distance between Jerusalem and Jericho via the old Roman road was about 29 kilometres or 18 miles. In this photograph you can see a group of pilgrims walking the ancient road. As you can see, Jericho is 252 metres below sea level, and Jerusalem is 774 metres above sea level. So it's quite a steep ascent from Jericho to Jerusalem. The final section of Luke's Gospel gives us an account of the last week in the life of Jesus, his teaching in Jerusalem, the Passion narrative, his resurrection and appearances of the risen Lord to the disciples, and finally, his ascension. The final 3 weeks of the liturgical calendar are devoted to the last week in the life of Jesus, culminating with Luke's account of the crucifixion on the 34th Sunday of Ordinary Time, the feast of Christ the King. This year, however, the feast of the dedication of the Lateran Basilica falls on the 32nd Sunday of Ordinary Time, and it takes precedence over the liturgy for Ordinary Time. The feast of All Souls' Day and the dedication of the Lateran Basilica are celebrated on a Sunday only when November the 2nd and November the 9th happen to fall on a Sunday. Jesus enters Jerusalem on the day that we traditionally call Palm or Passion Sunday. Luke then tells us that Jesus went into the temple and began driving out the traders, saying to them, "It is written, 'My house shall be a house of prayer, but you have turned it into a bandit's den.'" He taught every day in the temple, proclaiming the good news. The scribes and chief priests sought to lay hands on him, but they were afraid of the public reaction. The Gospel for the 32nd Sunday in Ordinary Time tells us that the Sadducees challenged Jesus about the resurrection of the dead, a belief that they did not accept. They put a hypothetical question to Jesus about 7 brothers, the first of whom had married a wife but died childless. The second, and then the third, married the widow, and the same with all 7. They all died, leaving no children. Finally, the woman herself died. Now, at the resurrection, the Sadducees ask, whose wife will she be, since she'd been married to all 7? You can read how Jesus responds to the Sadducees by going to Luke chapter 20, verses 34 to 40. So Jesus and his disciples are on the way to Jerusalem for the celebration of Passover. Passover was one of the 3 great pilgrimage feasts, along with Pentecost or Shavuot and Tabernacles or Sukkot. We read in the Torah, 3 times a year you will hold a festival in my honour. 3 times a year all your menfolk will appear before the Lord God. Pilgrims from Galilee travelled southwards to Jerusalem, but they never said we're going down to Jerusalem. Jews always referred to these pilgrimages as a going up to Jerusalem. And that is quite literally true. As we've already seen, Capernaum on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee is about 208 metres below sea level, while Jerusalem is about 774 metres above sea level. But for Jesus, this pilgrimage is about much more than a geographical ascent. Pope Benedict offered this reflection. To begin with, it is an ascent in a geographical sense, but the ultimate goal of Jesus' ascent is his self-offering on the cross. This ascent into God's presence leads via the cross. That's an interesting way of thinking about the journey to Jerusalem. It is an ascent into God's presence. We can be fairly certain that Jesus and the disciples would have prayed the Psalms of Ascent while walking together on the way to Jerusalem. The Psalms of Ascent, Psalms 120 to 134, are a collection of 15 psalms that were sung by pilgrims as they made their way to Jerusalem for significant religious festivals like Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. Jesus has also used the pilgrimage as an occasion to teach his followers about life in the kingdom of God. And much of that teaching has been about prayer. Earlier in chapter 11, the disciples asked Jesus to teach them how to pray, as John the Baptist had taught his disciples. Jesus then teaches them the prayer that today we know as the Lord's Prayer. After Jesus had taught his disciples the Lord's Prayer, he told a parable about persistence in prayer. In the middle of the night, a man goes to the house of his friend with a request. "My friend, lend me 3 loaves, because a friend of mine on his travels has just arrived at my house, and I have nothing to put before him." From inside the house the man answers, "Do not bother me. The door is bolted now, and my children are with me in bed. I cannot get up to give it to you." We're then told that if the man does not get up and give the loaves for friendship's sake, persistence will make him get up and give his friend all he needs. Last Sunday, you may remember, we listened to another parable about persistent prayer. A judge who had neither fear of God nor respect for others is worn down by the persistence of a widow who has a grievance against an enemy. If an unjust and self-centered judge is intimidated into action, how much more will a loving God readily answer our prayers without delay? Today we have the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. We're told that they both go up into the temple. The temple was situated at the highest point in the city, so they quite literally go up to the temple. This story poses the question, how should I enter into the presence of God? The Pharisee did not really go up to the temple to pray. He went to inform God how good he was. He thanks God that he is not grasping, unjust, and adulterous like the rest of mankind, and particularly that he is not like the tax collector. For first-century Jews, the tax collector was seen as an agent of Rome, and therefore a traitor to his own people. People would have presumed that he was corrupt and ruthless in exacting taxes. His presence in the temple would have been unexpected. Like Zacchaeus, whom we meet in chapter 19, he was a despised person. Just as the people first heard the parable of the Good Samaritan would have expected the Samaritan to be the villain in the story, likewise, people listening to today's parable would have thought the same of the tax collector. In both parables, stereotypes are overturned. The Samaritan is the true neighbour, and the tax collector is truly humble before God. The Pharisee's prayer is a litany of self-congratulation and self-aggrandizement. Absorbed in his own virtue, he goes on to tell God that he fasts twice a week and he pays tithes on all that he gets. There's an irony here. The disciplines of fasting and almsgiving are good in themselves, but we need to be honest about our motivation. There's a big difference between sanctity and sanctimoniousness. The spiritual disciplines undertaken by the Pharisee have only made him self-centered and judgmental. He has no empathy for others. This parable reminds me of a story told by the late Rabbi Lionel Blue during his weekly Thought for the Day on London's Radio 4. Here is a story about the Jewish Day of Atonement, the most solemn and serious fast in the Jewish year. As the service was about to begin, a hush came over the assembled congregation. The venerable rabbi held out his hand for silence. Instead of going to his pulpit, he approached the Holy Ark with tears in his eyes. He flung open the doors and prostrated himself before the scrolls. He then said in a strained voice, "Lord, have mercy on me, for I am only dust and ashes." After his confession, the congregation watched him as he arose and took his place at the reading desk. He opened his prayer book and was about to commence the solemn service, but before he could do so, the cantor of the synagogue approached the Holy Ark and said, "Lord, I too seek mercy, for I too am just dust and ashes." The cantor then took his place at the reading desk and signed to the rabbi that the service could begin. But then the janitor came forward with tears in his eyes. He too faced the ark with bowed head and spoke piously and gently. "Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner, who is but dust and ashes." The rabbi breathed deeply and turned to the cantor and said, "Look who presumes to think he is only dust and ashes." That reminds me of another story from the Jewish tradition about Israel ben Eliezer, who is the founder of the modern Hasidic movement within Judaism. He is known as the Baal Shem Tov, which means master of the good name. On one occasion, the Baal Shem Tov stopped at the threshold of a synagogue and refused to enter. When those around him asked why, he explained, "I cannot go in. It is crowded with teachings and prayers from wall to wall and from floor to ceiling. How could there be room for me?" The onlookers were puzzled by what he had said, so he explained, "The words from the lips of those whose teaching and praying does not come from hearts lifted to heaven cannot rise, but fill the house from wall to wall and from floor to ceiling." Such is the prayer of the Pharisee in today's Gospel and the Rabbi in Lionel Blue's story. They are filled with pompous self-importance, a posturing before God. By way of contrast, the prayer of the tax collector is one of heartfelt simplicity. He asks God to be merciful to him, a sinner. This parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector extends the theme of prayer that we considered last Sunday in the parable of the persistent widow and the unjust judge. That parable was about the promise of persistent prayer. Today's parable is about the peril of presumptuous prayer. Let's reflect on that word humble for a moment. Etymologically, it's associated with the word human. Both words come from the Latin word humus, which means soil. And that takes us back to the story of creation that we find in chapter 2 of the book of Genesis. We're told that God shaped the first human being from the soil of the ground. The Hebrew word for human being is Adam, and the Hebrew word for soil is Adamah. This play on words makes the point that humans are creatures made from the earth. And one way of describing the humble person is someone whose eyes are on the stars, but whose feet are firmly planted on the ground. It is being honest about who we are before God. The English writer C.S. Lewis made this observation: humility is not thinking less of yourself, it is thinking of yourself less. Today's second reading from the second letter of St. Paul to Timothy offers us another example of authentic humility. This letter was written while St. Paul was in prison awaiting his trial in Rome. In the Roman Empire, prisons were not places to which people were sentenced as a punishment. Prisons were simply places where people awaited trial. If found innocent, the prisoner was freed. If guilty, he would be punished. That meant he could be exiled, executed, fined, or reduced to slavery. So Paul is awaiting trial. He realizes that his death is imminent. He speaks of his life's work coming to an end with the expectation of a crown of victory for his faithful ministry. Looking back over his life, he uses an interesting metaphor. My life is being poured out like a libation. A libation was the offering of a liquid, such as wine, that was poured out during a sacrifice in the Jewish temple, such as the daily Holocaust. A libation of wine normally accompanied burnt and peace offerings. The entire libation was poured out. Paul is saying in so many words, my entire life has been a pouring out, an emptying out on behalf of the gospel. For many of us, the good life is not about emptying, but filling up. The more I've got, the happier I am. The more I've got, the more impressive my life has been. Look at the treasure house of my ego. I've accumulated lots of things: fame, esteem, success, money, assets, power, privilege, awards received, degrees earned. None of that would have impressed Paul. A life well lived is not about accumulating more and more. It is rather an emptying out on behalf of the gospel. Paul measures his life not by what he's accumulated, but by how much he's given away. In his letter to the Philippians, Paul writes, "For his sake I have suffered the loss of all things, and I regard them as rubbish, in order that I may gain Christ." The social commentator Hugh Mackay has written a book entitled The Good Life. The subtitle of this book asks the question, what makes a life worth living? And what does make a life worth living? Mackay argues that the good life is not the sum of our security, wealth, status, postcode, career success, and levels of happiness. The good life is one defined by our capacity for selflessness. In today's gospel, we have one person who comes before God full of himself. The other humbly empties himself, throwing himself upon God's mercy. In today's second reading, Paul tells us that the time has come for me to be gone. The Greek word used here is analusios, which means a loosing from moorings as a ship is about to set sail. So a literal translation of Paul's Greek is, the time to loose the moorings has come. It's the image of a ship that is about to set sail. Paul sees his whole life as a preparation for this journey to come. For him, death is not an ending, but a beginning. Paul then tells us, I have fought the good fight. Throughout his life, Paul has been a passionate advocate of the gospel, and he often encountered opposition. Winston Churchill once said, "Never trust a man who has no enemies. He stands for nothing." Well, that could never be said of St. Paul. In his second letter to the Corinthians, he tells us what he has had to endure for the sake of the gospel. 5 times I have received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I received a stoning. 3 times I was shipwrecked. For a night and a day I was adrift at sea. On frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from bandits, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers and sisters, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, hungry and thirsty, often without food, cold and naked. In today's gospel, Jesus tells his disciples, everyone who raises himself up will be humbled, but anyone who humbles himself will be raised up. The first reading from the book of Ecclesiasticus tells us that the prayer of the humble pierces the clouds. We have in today's gospel yet another example of a refrain that resonates throughout Luke's gospel, and that is, the great reversal. The note is sounded in Our Lady's great prayer of thanksgiving, the Magnificat. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their heart. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. Lazarus is covered with sores and languishes at the gate of the rich man who is dressed in purple and fine linen and feasts magnificently every day. Then comes the great reversal. When the poor man dies, he is carried away by the angels into Abraham's embrace. The rich man also dies and ends up in agony in the flames of Hades. The parable of the wedding banquet also refers to the great reversal that is to come. Those who choose the lowest place will be invited to move up higher. Those who have seated themselves in the place of honour will be relegated to the lowest place when a more distinguished person arrives. Those who choose now to sit with the poor and lowly are destined for promotion, while those who now sit with the rich and powerful will find themselves relegated to the lowest place. In Luke's version of the Beatitudes we read, "Blessed are you who are hungry now. Woe to you who have your fill now. Blessed are you who weep now. Woe to you who laugh now. Blessed are you when people hate you, drive you out, abuse you. Woe to you when the world speaks well of you." What is happening here? Jesus is making it very clear that the new life of God's kingdom is a complete reversal of the world's values. The standards of the world are turned upside down. God deflates the pretensions of the rich and fills the hungry with good things. Those who raise themselves up will be humbled, but those who humble themselves will be raised up. Cardinal Basil Hume was Archbishop of Westminster from 1976 until his death in 1999. He had been a Benedictine monk for 35 years when he was appointed Archbishop of Westminster, and he served in that role for 23 years. He chose today's parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector as the gospel to be read at his funeral mass. The homily was preached by his friend Bishop John Crowley, Bishop of Middlesbrough. Bishop Crowley took the congregation back to 1975 when there was media speculation about who would be the new Archbishop of Westminster. Bishop Crowley said this, "How long ago it all now seems since that famous newspaper article which appeared in September 1975. It listed for the very first time the name of Basil Hume as one of the 6 front-runners for the vacant see of Westminster. Each candidate was accorded a little pen picture, which noted their main advantages and disadvantages. Under the Abbot of Ampleforth, as Basil Hume then was, the main disadvantage was simply recorded. It read, 'Much too humble to make known his abilities. Could easily be missed.' How grateful we are to God today that he wasn't." 2 short months ago, when told of his terminal cancer, the Cardinal was, at first, tempted to feel, if only I could start all over again, I would be a much better monk, a much better abbot, a much better bishop. But then I thought, these are now his own words, then I thought, how much better if I can come before God when I die, not to say, thank you that I was such a good monk, good abbot, good bishop, but rather, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. For if I come empty-handed, then I will be ready to receive God's gift. God be merciful to me, a sinner. May we, like Basil Hume, realize the wisdom of coming before God not only with an awareness of our sins, but also with an abiding trust in God's mercy.